He looked into the girl's eyes and said, "I don't know you." She pulled out a photo, slammed it on the podium, and screamed, "That's my mother, your housekeeper. You left her to die, and I'm your daughter." At the height of his power, Richard Evans stood untouchable, a billionaire real estate mogul hailed as a visionary, a philanthropist, a self-made man. But beneath the glass towers bearing his name and the carefully curated image of success was a truth he buried decades ago. He thought it was over, forgotten, paid for in silence and buried in dust. Until the night of the annual Evans Foundation Gala, when a teenage girl with fierce eyes and trembling hands stepped up to the microphone. She wasn't on the guest list. No one knew her name. But what she carried shattered everything. In front of senators, CEOs, and flashing cameras. She pulled out a torn photograph and said 10 words that made the entire ballroom freeze. "This is my mother. You left her to die." Whispers turned to gasps. The air grew thick with the weight of unraveling legacy. Because what no one knew, not even Richard himself, was that the past had a face, a name, and it had come back, not for revenge, but for truth, and maybe for justice. Willow Creek. Georgia wasn't on most maps. Tucked between swaying pine trees and forgotten railroad tracks, it was the kind of town where Sunday church attendance mattered more than state law, and where secrets could live for generations beneath polished smiles and neatly cut lawns. Here, reputations weren't earned, they were inherited, defended like sacred relics, and any threat to that legacy was swiftly erased, not with violence, but with silence and shame. At the heart of this picture-perfect southern town stood the Evans estate, an ivory mansion perched above the rest, like a watchtower of wealth and power. Everyone in Willow Creek knew the Evans name. Richard Evans was more than a man. He was a myth, a benefactor who built the library, sponsored the high school football team, and funded every 4th of July parade. But the town also knew better than to ask questions about where his money came from, or who might have been crushed along the way. The local paper never printed bad press about him. The sheriff always shook his hand a little too tightly, and those who had once tried to speak up, they either left town quietly or stayed and learned to pretend. It was in this tightly wound web of image and omission that the story begins before the microphones, before the photo, before the reckoning. Willow Creek was peaceful, too peaceful, and that peace had a price. Richard Evans was the kind of man people pointed to with admiration, envy, or fear depending on who you asked. With his silver-streaked hair, custom-tailored suits, and courtroom voice that could command a room or silence a jury, he was the embodiment of Southern success. To the public, he was a hero of Willow Creek, a man who had lifted the town with his brilliance, generosity, and spotless family values. He ran the most powerful law firm in 3 counties, had a photo with the governor in his study, and never missed a Sunday service at First Baptist Church. He hosted charity galas beneath crystal chandeliers, gave commencement speeches at the local high school, and every Christmas, children lined up outside the Evans estate for gifts handed out by the man himself. He was a husband, a father, a mentor, and, as the town believed, a man of unshakable integrity. But behind that polished smile was a fortress of control. Richard curated every inch of his image like a legal brief, omitting, redacting, rewriting. His kindness was often performative, his charity selective, and his presence in people's lives, though influential, came with unspoken conditions. Those closest to him lived in a gilded cage, bound by loyalty or fear. He was admired, yes, but also untouchable. And in Willow Creek, being untouchable meant never being questioned, until one day, someone did. The town was already buzzing with anticipation as banners bearing Richard Evans's face fluttered above Main Street, reading, "Celebrating a Legacy of Integrity." Inside the grand ballroom of Willow Creek's historic courthouse, newly renovated and polished for the occasion, florists arranged white roses in symmetrical perfection, while local officials rehearsed their lines. Tonight, Richard would receive the Outstanding Citizen of the Year award, the highest honor the town bestowed, reserved only for those deemed pillars of virtue. His name had been whispered with reverence in town halls and dinner tables for decades, but tonight, it would be etched into a plaque, immortalized. Upstairs, in his oak-paneled study, Richard stood before a mirror adjusting his cufflinks monogrammed. Of course, his mind running through his speech with meticulous care. "Service is not a duty, it's a calling," he would say. "Legacy is built not by power, but by purpose." He'd rehearsed it so many times it came off as effortless, natural, just like everything he did. His wife, Margaret, smiled proudly as she handed him the navy blue tie she'd picked out for the event. Their children, raised on expectations and perfection, would be seated front row, camera ready. The governor was attending. News crews had been notified. Richard Evans was ready to accept not just the award, but the admiration of a town that never thought to question whether the man they worshipped had anything to hide. To the outside world, Richard Evans was the embodiment of the American patriarch, solid, composed, and unshakably moral. At church on Sundays, he sat with Evelyn, his elegant and devoted wife of 22 years, their hands always gently clasped, like a postcard of enduring love. Their 2 children, Matthew and Grace, completed the portrait of a perfect Southern family. Matthew, a high school senior already fielding early admission offers from Ivy League schools, and Grace, just 13, a violin prodigy with a wall full of trophies and a heart full of adoration for her father. In public, Richard always knew how to strike the right balance between stern guidance and affectionate encouragement. He attended every school play, shook hands with every teacher, and never missed a parent-teacher conference. On weekends, he could be seen teaching Matthew how to mow the lawn with symmetrical precision, or cheering for Grace at her recitals with tears quietly welling in his eyes. Evelyn, too, played her role with seamless grace, hosting charity luncheons, organizing church drives, and always standing a half step behind her husband, radiating pride without overshadowing him. Together, they were the gold standard of Willow Creek's moral compass, a family so pristine that even the town's most cynical gossipers found no dirt to cling to. The Evanses were not just respected, they were revered. And no one, not even their closest friends, had reason to doubt the truth behind their carefully polished image. But beneath the carefully manicured lawns and the polished smiles, beneath the Sunday sermons and the family portraits framed in gold, Richard Evans harbored a secret that pulsed like a silent wound beneath his skin. Years ago, before the acclaim, before the Father of the Year photos and the speeches at the country club, there had been a night with Tanya Whitman, a quiet, bright-eyed young woman who had worked at the courthouse as a clerk. She was kind, sharp-witted, and carried herself with a dignity that defied the way people in Willow Creek often looked at women who looked like her. Their affair had been short, hidden behind the heavy drapes of late-night office meetings and whispered phone calls. When Tanya told him she was pregnant, Richard didn't yell. He didn't cry. He simply paused, swallowed hard, and said, "This can never come out. The town wasn't ready. His career wasn't ready. His family couldn't know. And so Tanya was left alone to carry the child, alone to deliver her daughter without a birth certificate bearing Richard's name, alone to whisper to the baby why her father never came." The years passed. The child grew, and Richard locked the memory in a box inside himself, wrapping it in justifications and silence. He told himself he had no choice, that it was for the greater good. But sometimes, when Grace laughed too hard, or Matthew narrowed his eyes in that exact way Tanya once did, a flicker of recognition would stab through him, and for just a second, the man who had everything remembered the life he had quietly erased. Naomi Pierce walked into the Willow Creek courthouse with the poise of someone who had nothing to prove and everything to defend. Her heels clicked against the old marble floors, echoing through halls once closed to voices like hers. She wasn't born into legacy or privilege, not raised in mansions or taught at prep schools. Naomi came from the southern edge of Atlanta, raised by a single mother who cleaned offices at night and recited Maya Angelou to her at dawn. Every piece of her rise was carved from resistance, the scholarships she fought for, the jobs she took between classes, the nights she spent studying while her cousins slept 3 to a room. Now, she stood tall, a Harvard-trained lawyer, a viral TEDx speaker whose talk, Rising While They Watch You Fall, had racked up over 10 million views. To the public, she was a symbol of hope, of what Black excellence could look like in a system not built for it. To herself, she was a woman still haunted by unanswered questions, the gap in her birth records, the way her mother flinched when she asked about her father, the man no one dared name. Naomi had come to Willow Creek not just for justice in a new case, but to confront the ghosts wrapped in Southern charm and polite silence. What she didn't yet know was that her search for truth would rattle the town's most sacred institution and drag Richard Evans into a reckoning 27 years overdue. It was a quiet Sunday morning in Willow Creek, the kind of morning that smelled of fresh biscuits and magnolia blossoms, when Evelyn Evans slid a magazine across the kitchen table toward her husband. The steam from Richard's coffee curled upward, momentarily obscuring the glossy page until he lowered his cup and glanced down. "Look at her," Evelyn said softly, her voice a curious mixture of nostalgia and unease. "This girl. She looks like me when I was younger." Don't you think Richard blinked? The image of Naomi Pierce staring back at him with the same fierce, almond-shaped eyes he'd once fallen in love with, only they weren't Evelyn's. They were Tanya's. The young woman on the cover wasn't just a rising star-in-law or a celebrated voice from the TEDx stage. She was a mirror Richard had tried to avoid for nearly 3 decades. Her face a haunting echo of a truth he had buried so deep it had started to feel like fiction. His hand trembled slightly as he traced the outline of her face with his eyes, not daring to touch the paper. "Who is she?" Evelyn asked again, still staring. But Richard couldn't answer, not immediately, because the girl on the cover wasn't just a coincidence. She was the storm he knew one day would find its way to his doorstep. And Evelyn kind. Loyal Evelyn had no idea that the resemblance wasn't just uncanny. It was genetic. Richard stared at the magazine for one long, breathless moment, the edges of his composure already fraying beneath the weight of recognition. His face, normally a mask of calm authority, began to drain of color before flushing into a dangerous shade of crimson. The room around him seemed to tighten, the walls of their pristine kitchen inching closer as Evelyn waited for a response that would never come. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. His jaw clenched so tightly it looked painful. Without a word, he pushed back his chair, the soft scrape of wood on tile far louder than it should have been. He didn't look at her. Couldn't. Because if he did, she would see it, the guilt, the fear, the unraveling lie. Grabbing his jacket from the back of the chair, he moved through the house like a man escaping a fire, each step carrying the weight of a past he could no longer control. Evelyn called his name once, tentative and confused. But he didn't stop, didn't answer. The door clicked shut behind him with a finality that made her flinch, and then he was gone, swallowed by the cold morning air. Outside, Richard stood for a moment on the porch, breathing hard. The image of Naomi Pierce burned into his mind. Not as a stranger, not as a coincidence, but as blood, as consequence, as the truth he'd sealed behind a smile for far too long. In the cracked heart suburbs of Atlanta, where chain-link fences sag and kids play ball barefoot in weed-choked lots, Tanya Pierce lived quietly, carving dignity from struggle with every sunrise. Her neighborhood bore the weight of decades of broken promises, blighted buildings, flickering streetlights, and the steady hum of sirens after dark, but inside her modest two-bedroom apartment. Tanya had built a sanctuary. She was a nurse now, working the overnight shift at Grady Memorial Hospital, tending to lives others had long since written off. The uniform didn't pay much, but it kept the lights on and Naomi in school, and for Tanya, that was enough. She hadn't spoken Richard Evans's name in over 25 years, hadn't needed to. Every time she looked at Naomi sharp-eyed, relentless, brilliant, she saw the shadow of him, the ambition, the fire, the secrets. But Naomi was her own woman now, made not in his image but in the forge of Tanya's sacrifices. She'd shielded her daughter from the shame, from the truth of that summer night so long ago, when Richard had whispered promises with one hand still holding his future. He had walked away before the pregnancy test turned pink, and Tanya, just 17, had stood alone in a clinic parking lot clutching her stomach like it held the sun. Now, as Naomi's face appeared on TEDx banners and magazine covers, Tanya watched from their worn couch, pride wrestling with the past. She had never asked for recognition, only enough time to protect Naomi from the bloodline that denied her. One evening, as the orange Atlanta sun melted behind the chipped blinds of their apartment, Naomi sat at the kitchen table, her laptop closed but her thoughts wide open. Tanya stirred a pot of lentil stew with tired hands. Still in her scrubs, the faint smell of antiseptic clinging to her like a second skin. Naomi's eyes didn't leave her mother. "Why have you never told me about my father?" she asked quietly, her voice low but firm, like a question rehearsed for years but only now allowed to live. Tanya froze, spoon suspended midair, her back to her daughter. A silence fell between them. Not unfamiliar, but this one was heavier, one that didn't come from exhaustion, but from memory. Naomi waited, her heart pounding, searching her mother's stillness for answers. Tanya turned slowly, meeting Naomi's eyes with a gaze filled not with guilt, but something deeper. Grief. Maybe even protection. "Because I wanted you to know who you were before knowing who he wasn't," she said at last, her voice rough. Naomi didn't speak, didn't blink. Tanya continued, each word pulled from a place long buried. "He wasn't ready. I was. He had a name. I had you. And I decided if it meant you could grow up strong, smart, untouched by his silence, I would carry the shame so you wouldn't have to." Naomi didn't cry, but her breath caught, in that moment. A crack opened in the foundation of everything she thought she knew, and the truth simmered for years finally rose to the surface, thick and undeniable. Tanya sat down across from Naomi, her fingers nervously twisting the corner of a dish towel, eyes glistening with the weight of memories she'd carried alone for over 2 decades. Her voice, usually so calm and composed after years of tending to patients in their weakest moments, now trembled with something far more personal. "Because the truth wasn't going to make you stronger," she said. "Not bitterly, but with a solemn acceptance. The truth wasn't going to pay our rent. It wasn't going to help you get into law school. It wasn't going to stop people from looking down on you because of your skin or your hair or the way you spoke up in a room full of people who didn't want to listen. I kept the truth from you because I didn't want it to become your excuse or your wound. I thought, if I could protect you from his rejection, then maybe you wouldn't carry it in your bones like I did. Naomi's lips parted slightly, as if to speak, but nothing came out. Tanya leaned forward, voice soft but steady now. But you grew up anyway. You made your own name. Carved your own place in a world that never handed you anything. You didn't need him to make you whole. You did that yourself. Naomi felt her throat tighten, her chest burn. For the first time, she understood this wasn't cowardice. It was love sharpened by sacrifice, truth wrapped in silence. Tanya stood up and walked slowly to the hallway closet, where a weathered shoebox sat high on the shelf, hidden beneath a pile of old sweaters. She brought it down and placed it carefully on the table in front of Naomi. With a deep breath, she opened the lid to reveal a single, neatly folded letter, yellowed with time, but still sealed in its original envelope. Tanya's fingers hesitated over it, then slid it gently toward her daughter. "I did try to tell him," she said quietly. "Back then, when I first found out I was pregnant." Naomi looked down at the envelope, her eyes narrowing in confusion. "You wrote to him," Tanya nodded. "His office address. I didn't have much, not even a phone number, but I knew where he worked. I wrote everything that I was pregnant, that it was his, that I didn't want money, just honesty. I told him I'd keep the baby and raise her on my own, but I felt he had the right to know." Her voice dropped even lower. "He never wrote back, never showed up. I checked the mailbox every day for months, then stopped. Eventually, I convinced myself he'd read it and decided to forget us." Naomi stared at the envelope, her thoughts spinning. It was a small twist of fate, one letter that might have changed everything. Or maybe it never reached him. Either way, silence had spoken loudest. Naomi Pierce was halfway through drafting her next TEDx outline when the email landed in her inbox. At first, it looked like another invitation to speak at a regional law conference, one of many that had poured in since her latest keynote on systemic reform in rural justice. But as her eyes scanned the subject line, she paused. Honorary guest speaker invitation, Willow Creek Citizens Gala. Curiosity flickered. She clicked it open, and her breath caught. The email came directly from the Willow Creek Town Council, formally inviting her to deliver the keynote speech at the upcoming gala, celebrating none other than Richard Evans, who was to be honored as Outstanding Citizen of the Year. Her fingers froze on the trackpad. Richard Evans. The name Tanya had whispered only once. The one name never spoken again. Naomi had Googled him that night in secret. Successful attorney, philanthropist, model family man in a town that practically worshipped him. And now here was an invitation to speak in his honor, to stand on the same stage as him, maybe even shake his hand. A man she'd never met, but who had, without question, altered the entire trajectory of her life. She leaned back in her chair, the edges of the screen blurring. Was this fate, irony, or some test of everything she'd built for herself? She didn't tell her mother immediately. She just hit reply, typed 3 words: "I accept, thank you," and pressed send. Naomi sat at the kitchen table, staring at the printed invitation, its gold-trimmed edges catching the morning light like it belonged in someone else's life. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of everything unspoken. Tanya stood at the sink rinsing out a coffee mug, her back rigid, shoulders tense. Naomi didn't know how to begin, so she simply placed the invitation between them on the counter, like a confession. "It's him," she finally said. Voice low. The man being honored. "It's him. Isn't it?" Tanya didn't turn around. She didn't need to. Silence stretched between them like an old wound reopened. Naomi waited, searching her mother's profile for a sign for anger, pain, regret, but found only stillness. "I don't know if I can go," Naomi whispered, her voice tight with everything she'd never dared ask. What would I even say standing up there in front of him? Tanya dried the mug slowly, then finally turned, her eyes unreadable but calm. "Go," she said, her voice steady, but laced with something old and deep. "Not for him, for you. Because you earned that stage. Because every step you've taken without him has led you to this moment. And because standing in your truth doesn't require anyone's permission, especially not his." Naomi's eyes stung. She nodded, not with certainty, but with something stronger resolve. Naomi stood by her bedroom window that night, watching the streetlights flicker across cracked sidewalks and silent mailboxes, a neighborhood that had raised her with more truth than comfort. The invitation sat on her desk like a dare she hadn't accepted yet, but couldn't ignore. She wasn't going there to make a scene, to unearth a scandal, or to demand acknowledgement in front of a crowd. No, that wasn't her style. What she wanted wasn't glory, it was clarity. She wasn't interested in headlines or retribution. She just needed to look him in the eye. Because silence, she had learned, wasn't just the absence of sound. It was a wound that had shaped every room she entered, every father-daughter dance she never attended, every time she wondered why her mother's eyes got distant when other parents showed up. She wasn't seeking an apology. Apologies meant nothing when they arrived 30 years late. But she deserved presence. She deserved to speak not publicly, but personally, to the man who had lived 2 towns away and still managed to be more distant than a stranger. This wasn't about revenge or drama. It was about healing the kind of pain that only dissolves when you stop pretending it doesn't exist. Naomi didn't want to be known as the girl with the secret. She just wanted to stop carrying one. Naomi took a slow breath as she walked toward the podium, her heels tapping against the polished hardwood floor of Willow Creek's town hall, where banners hung in honor of Richard Evans, the man the town hailed as a hero, a leader, a father to all. The crowd quieted, anticipating another polished speech from a rising star. But Naomi's voice, when it came, wasn't rehearsed perfection. It was steady, raw, and deliberate. "I'm not standing here tonight because I'm a lawyer," she began, scanning the crowd until her gaze landed, unflinching, on Richard. "I'm not here because I've spoken on stages around the world or because I grew up to defy the odds. I'm here because once I was just a child unseen, unwanted, unanswered. A little girl who asked her mother one too many times why her father never called, never showed up, never said her name." Whispers rippled through the room. Naomi pressed forward. "That man, my father, is the very man you're honoring tonight. And while you applaud the legend, I've lived with the silence of the man, the one who chose image over integrity, the one who never wrote back." Gasps escaped the room as Naomi continued. "I'm not here to shame him. I'm here because the truth deserves a seat at the same table as legacy, because a town built on image deserves to reckon with the stories it buried to stay proud." For a long, suspended moment, time seemed to freeze inside Willow Creek's grand town hall. Naomi's final words still echoed faintly against the paneled walls, but it wasn't her voice that held the room. Now it was the silence that followed, sharp and suffocating. Every eye turned, slowly and in unison, toward Richard Evans, the mayor, the judges, the donors in the front row. Even Evelyn and their 2 children sitting just off stage, each one turned to face the man they thought they knew. His perfectly tailored suit, his rehearsed smile, his polished shoes all suddenly seemed to betray him. Richard didn't move. His hands, once clasped in anticipation of applause, now trembled ever so slightly on his lap. His face drained of color, jaw clenched, eyes blinking rapidly as if trying to will away the truth that had just shattered the carefully built myth of his life. The crowd didn't erupt. They didn't applaud. They didn't gasp. Instead, an unbearable tension settled over the room, judgmental, bewildered, betrayed. Some guests looked down, ashamed they'd cheered for a man without knowing the full story. Others stared at Richard with a mixture of confusion and dawning realization. Naomi had not just opened an old wound. She had ripped the veil off an entire town's collective illusion, and now, under the weight of 100 piercing gazes, Richard Evans sat in the ruins of his reputation, caught between past denial and present exposure. Naomi's hands didn't shake as she reached into the folder she had brought on stage, her fingers deliberately unfolding the crisp sheet of paper she had kept hidden until now. The quiet crackle of the document being revealed seemed louder than any thunder, slicing through the breathless stillness of the hall. Her voice was steady, firm, and heartbreakingly clear as she held up the paper high enough for everyone to see. For those still unsure, she said, her eyes locking with Richard's across the stage. This is a certified DNA test, issued 3 months ago, confirming with 99.9% certainty that I am the biological daughter of Richard Evans. A collective intake of breath swept across the room, like the walls themselves had exhaled in shock. Naomi didn't falter. I didn't bring this to ruin a ceremony. She continued, I brought this because the truth deserves a seat at every table where legacy is discussed. Because silence isn't neutral, it protects the comfortable and punishes the forgotten. For 29 years, I've lived with a name that was never mine, a story that was never acknowledged, and a father who chose convenience over courage. She paused, lowering the document slightly, her voice softening but losing none of its force. You don't have to applaud me. I'm not here to be applauded. I'm here to remind us all that image isn't truth and that sometimes justice shows up in a black dress, holding a sheet of paper. Evelyn sat frozen in her front row seat, her hands clenched together so tightly that her knuckles blanched, eyes wide in disbelief as the woman on stage, young, composed, undeniably powerful, uttered the words she had feared deep down might one day surface. Her breath hitched as Naomi held up the DNA test like a sword cutting through decades of curated image, and Evelyn's world cracked open in silent horror. Beside her, their son Daniel. The golden boy raised in the glow of Richard's legacy rose suddenly from his seat, jaw clenched, fury flooding his face. This is insane, he muttered, his voice sharp, trembling not from confusion but betrayal. Tell me this isn't true. Dad, tell me she's lying. But Richard remained seated, his silence damning, his eyes clouded in something between shame and paralysis. The organizers, meanwhile, shifted uncomfortably backstage and around the podium, whispering frantically into earpieces, exchanging panicked glances as camera crews hesitated, unsure whether to cut the broadcast or let the drama unfold. What was supposed to be a polished evening, celebrating civic excellence, had collapsed into a real-time reckoning, the script shredded by truth. The audience, once buzzing with admiration, now buzzed with disbelief and electric tension, torn between sympathy, outrage, and curiosity. No one knew what would happen next, but they knew this night, this moment, would be etched forever in the town's memory. Richard didn't utter a single word. As Naomi's voice faded into the charged silence of the auditorium, every eye fixed on him, expecting denial, outrage, or some desperate attempt at reputation-saving rhetoric. But none came. Instead, he remained seated, rigid at first. Then slowly, deliberately, he bowed his head. His once confident posture collapsed inward like a house quietly caving from rot long concealed. The applause he was meant to receive only minutes ago now echoed like a cruel memory in his ears, replaced by the sound of breathless waiting. His shoulders began to tremble, and a single tear traced down his weathered cheek, carving through years of carefully composed pride. Richard Evans, the man hailed for justice, integrity, fatherhood, sat wordless beneath the bright lights, undone not by scandal, but by truth. His silence wasn't cowardice. It was confession, not in words, but in surrender. He didn't shake his head. He didn't look at Evelyn, whose breath had stopped beside him, or at Daniel, whose anger hovered dangerously between disbelief and devastation. He didn't even glance at Naomi, who stood rooted above him with paper still in hand. He simply sat there, a man stripped of title, performance, and power, crying softly into his own shaking hands as everything he'd hidden finally arrived publicly, rightfully at his feet. Naomi stood motionless for a long moment, letting the weight of her words settle into the silence Richard's tears had created. The paper in her hand trembled slightly, but her voice, when it finally returned, was clear, steady, and devastatingly calm. "I don't need anything from you," she said, locking eyes with the man who had once decided her absence was easier than her existence. "Not your name, not your money, not your guilt. I just needed the truth. Because for years, I built myself out of silence, out of the echo of questions no one dared to answer. I grew up watching other kids run to their fathers while I clung to stories my mother wouldn't tell. I made it here not in spite of the void you left, but because of it. That void taught me how to speak for myself, how to fight, how to rise. But even the strongest voice still aches to know it wasn't born from nothing. I don't want anything except for you to admit, out loud, what you chose to bury. I need it not for me, but for the girl I used to be. The one who stared at the mailbox waiting for a letter that never came. She deserves that truth. Not to forgive you, not to love you, but to finally be free of wondering why she wasn't enough to be claimed. The room had turned to stone, every breath caught, every eye fixed on Naomi and Richard, suspended in the aftermath of truth too long withheld. Then, like the crack of dawn after an endless storm, movement came from the front row. Evelyn Evans, the picture of Southern grace and composure for 3 decades, stood. No gasp accompanied her rise, but a collective hush deepened, as if the air itself braced for the fracture of a family's perfect illusion. Her heels echoed across the wooden floor with quiet finality, and she ascended the stage not with fury, nor shame, but with something far more disarming resolve. Naomi turned, startled, unsure whether to step back or brace for impact. But Evelyn, with eyes not of a betrayed wife, but of a woman who had lived long enough to understand both grief and grace, extended her hand. Her voice, when she spoke, barely rose above a whisper, but it rang louder than any applause. "You've carried this alone long enough." The audience didn't move. No one had expected this the wife, not collapsing, not accusing, but bridging the distance between a lie and the child it left behind. Evelyn gently placed her arm around Naomi's shoulders, and as she led her down the steps, a new story was being written, not one of betrayal, but of reckoning, of acknowledgement, and of a mother reaching out to the daughter she never knew she needed to love. The rain had started falling just as Richard Evans turned off the main road and onto the narrow lane that led to the modest neighborhood on the outskirts of Atlanta, the kind of place he'd once sworn never to set foot in again. A place wrapped in silence, struggle, and the echoes of a choice he'd buried deep inside for decades. His polished black shoes looked absurd on the cracked concrete as he stepped out of the car, the hem of his designer slacks brushing against weeds poking through the sidewalk. With every step toward the small brick house at the end of the street, his chest tightened, not from fear of confrontation, but from the weight of memory. The last time he had stood here, Tanya had been 22, wide-eyed and still hopeful, clutching a letter he never answered. He had been a different man then, cowardly, ambitious, terrified. Now, the lights in the house were dim, but one glowed faintly in the front room. He stood before the door, soaked, hands trembling not from the cold but from guilt, grief, and something dangerously close to hope. He knocked not once, but 3 times, gently, almost reverently. No answer. Then, through the blinds, a shadow moved. Richard's heart stuttered as the door creaked open, revealing Tanya Pierce, older now, stronger, with eyes that had seen too much. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Everything they had left unsaid for 30 years hung between them, raw, trembling, and finally undeniable. Richard stepped into the small living room, the scent of lavender and old paper hanging in the air like a memory preserved too long. He moved slowly, as if afraid that any sudden gesture might break the fragile truce that Tanya's silence allowed. His eyes scanned the walls, the photos, the worn armchair by the window where 1,000 nights must have passed without him. Then, wordlessly, he reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out a weathered bundle, bound together with a simple piece of string worn, crumpled envelopes stained with time and remorse. His hands shook as he placed them gently on the table between them. "I wrote them all," he said, voice gravelly, trembling. "Every birthday, every milestone, every time I saw Naomi's name in the news. I wrote when I couldn't sleep. I wrote when I drank too much and remembered. I wrote 100 times, but I never had the courage to send even one." Tanya didn't reach for the letters. She only stared at the stack, her arms folded, heart walled. Cowardice isn't softened by ink, her eyes seemed to say. Richard's face tightened with shame. "I was scared," he whispered, "of losing everything I'd built, of facing you, of seeing the truth in her eyes. And for the first time." Tanya looked at him not with anger, but with a quiet ache that said, "You lost us anyway." Tanya stood in the doorway, arms crossed but her voice steady, no longer trembling with the fury of the past, but firm with the weight of a mother's truth. Richard opened his mouth, maybe to apologize, maybe to beg for understanding, but she held up her hand and shook her head slowly. "Don't waste your breath saying sorry to me," she said, her eyes locking onto his with a quiet intensity that cut deeper than any shout. "You don't get to rewrite the past with tears or letters that never left your drawer. I don't need your guilt, Richard. I've carried enough for both of us." She walked past him, toward the table where the stack of unsent letters sat like a pile of forgotten chances. "What you owe me is nothing. What you owe Naomi is everything," she continued, her voice softening only slightly. "She grew up never knowing who she was. Every award, every headline, Every standing ovation, she earned all of it, while wondering why the man who helped bring her into this world couldn't bring himself to acknowledge her. Tanya turned and looked him dead in the eyes. You want to fix something. Don't do it for me. Show up for her now. Show her she wasn't a secret to be buried. Show her she matters more than your image. That's the only apology that means anything. Under the harsh lights of the town hall press room, Richard Evans stood at the podium, his polished image now stripped down to something raw, humbled, and unmistakably human. The room fell silent, the sea of reporters waiting not for a denial, but for a confession. He looked out at the crowd, voice trembling only slightly as he began. I stand before you not as the man you once celebrated, but as the man I truly am, flawed, ashamed, and no longer hiding. He took a breath, letting the silence speak before continuing. I do not deserve the title of Outstanding Citizen of the Year. I accept that now. That honor belongs to those who live with integrity when no one is watching, like Tanya Pierce, a mother who raised an extraordinary daughter without help, without applause, like Naomi Pierce, who became a light in this world despite being born into shadow. Murmurs rippled through the room, but Richard pressed on. From this day forward, I will use my voice, my platform, and every cent of the award's endowment to fund scholarships for young people like Naomi, those born into silence and stigma. I will contribute to shelters for single mothers and foundations that support children rejected by their own blood. His voice steadied. This is not redemption. This is responsibility. I am not asking for your forgiveness. I am asking for your attention so no other child grows up feeling invisible in a room full of applause. At the very back of the crowded hall, past the rows of flashing cameras and whispering spectators, Naomi Pierce sat alone, her presence almost unnoticed amid the chaos of headlines being born in real time. She wore no expression of triumph, no satisfaction or smugness, only the calm, weary stillness of a woman who had carried a truth far too heavy for far too long. The words Richard Evans had spoken about responsibility, about her mother, about children left in the shadows cut through the noise with the precision of truth, finally spoken aloud. She watched him, not as a daughter yearning for affection, nor as a lawyer judging a man's fall from grace, but simply as a witness to a moment that should have come decades earlier. And yet, something softened in her chest. Not forgiveness, no. That would take more than words from a podium, but acknowledgement. A first step. She lowered her eyes, her hands clasped together tightly in her lap, and as the audience leaned forward to catch every word from the man they once idolized, Naomi remained still. Then, with no cameras pointing her way and no eyes demanding a performance, she did something she hadn't done since the day she found his name on her birth certificate. She nodded, just once, quietly, almost imperceptibly, but it was enough. In real life, we don't always get the apology we deserve. Sometimes, the people who hurt us never say the words. But what we do with the silence, that's where the healing begins. Naomi Pierce didn't step forward to destroy someone's reputation. She stood up to reclaim her own. Her story reminds us that speaking the truth isn't about vengeance. It's about liberation. For so long, Naomi lived in the shadow of a name that never acknowledged her. And when she finally stood in the light, she did so not to beg for a place at the table, but to show she had built her own. There are many Naomis in the world, children raised on strength instead of support. Single mothers like Tanya who carry the weight of two people's responsibilities, and even fathers like Richard flawed, late, but not beyond redemption. This story teaches us that it's never too late to tell the truth, to show up, or to make things right, not perfectly, but honestly. And maybe the greatest courage isn't just in being right, but in being real. If there's something you've been carrying, an untold truth, an apology you never gave, or a question you've been too afraid to ask, let this be your sign. Speak it. Live it. Heal from it. The world doesn't change with grand gestures. It changes when ordinary people choose to do the next right thing. If this story moved you, let us know in the comments. Save it if you need this reminder someday. And don't forget to like, follow, and share for more powerful stories that matter.